I just wanted to ask, you've had some polling data that your institute has put out as well. Maybe not all of it is out in the public domain. But I'd like you to just discuss, after you, I'll ask you about the data sample and the methods, etc. But what were the participant preferences for each candidate, and what can we deduce about, for example, the participants' policy priorities and what the politicians seem to think should be the policy priorities?
So we sort of had two recent rounds of polling. We had some polling in the couple of months before the 2019 presidential election. It was very small scale, where we did ask for voting attention. And just to give you some idea of the accuracy of that poll, we only polled those questions in 6 districts, and our prediction of the presidential vote shares was accurate in those 6 districts to within 1 percentage point, right? Okay. Which I think is better than the polling for some of the major political parties that they were doing. So, so I think, just to give you some idea of the accuracy. So yes, so we've been polling people.
So what is the sample size roughly? And let's say 2019.
2019 was only a few hundred. It was sort of an experimental effort. Now we're talking about 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 people.
Great.
This is in the last 12 months, shall we say.
Great.
So in terms of candidates, I mean, we've been tracking presidential and general election voting preference since August of last year. We do it on a daily basis. And what it shows is that for, through the end of 2021, President Gotabaya, the ex-President Gotabaya, was favored. And then starting, and I think partly because the economy seemed to improve, at least that's how people felt it at the end of 2021. Okay. But then as the economic problems began to bite in the first half of this year, his popularity declined. In line with consumer confidence, it collapsed. And Sajith Premadasa took the lead. And he's taken a modest lead, and it sort of fluctuated until last week when the president left office. So that sort of situation, Sajith Premadasa maintained a small but modest lead over the ex-president in terms of presidential voting preference. Now, I should explain, we only allow people to give 2 choices. Okay. So we didn't ask about potential other candidates, and so that's something we may have to change. Okay. But that's on the presidential polling. Maybe on the general election polling, then that's a bit more interesting. So if you...
may I just ask before, is there a demographic, specific demographic you ask, or is there something you can give us about the sample? Whether are they middle class, upper middle class, working class? How is it?
Sure.
Do you have any idea? I mean,
we actually have 2 different samples that we use. Okay. So one is a sample which we recruited in 2019. It was part of another scientific study done for epidemiological reasons. Okay. And that was nationwide, 300 communities in the country. It was designed for epidemiological purposes to give very accurate estimates. Okay. Percentage of people have hypertension to within within a few percentage, within a tenth of a decimal point, shall we say. Okay. So it was designed to be very robust, and it covers everyone, all income levels, all ethnicities, all parts of the country, et cetera, et cetera. So we are repolling those people by phone, and of course, the problem with a phone survey, you can't reach the poorest people. Right. Right. They don't have phones, or they keep their phones switched off. They can't afford to keep the phones on. We also have a second sample, which is a standard random, we call random digit dial phone survey. We just call numbers randomly. And that sample is clearly skewed, as you would expect. It's skewed towards more urban people, younger people, better educated, higher income, etc. But what we then do is we combine that, and using the information we have from previously, we re-weight the data so it is representative of every income level, every ethnic group, every province. So it's weighted across all dimensions. And for our political preference estimates, we also weight for the way people voted in the 2019 presidential election, and also how they voted in the 2020 general election.
Right, okay, so you've weighted it across, okay.
Right, and this is quite critical, because I think the problem we find, I suspect anybody else doing this would find, is that when you ask people their voting preference, at least in the past year or so, until last week, the sort of people who opposed the government were much more reluctant to admit their preference.
Right.
So they would typically tell you, I wouldn't vote for anyone, or they would refuse to. And this is quite substantial. But you can see that when you then analyze the data, you can see these people are actually not typical. They're more likely to have supported the other candidate. And so we adjust for that. So we use standard polling industry from the US methods to adjust for all that.
Okay. You had mentioned in our chat before we started that the JVP NPP was a resurgence. So I just wanted to ask whether where you see that resurgence, it's specific. Is it the corruption, anti-corruption emphasis that they use, or is there some other thing that you've noticed in your polling data? And generally speaking, the JVP is popular in the run-up to an election, but then when the actual votes come in, they never seem to translate that into votes.
I think past history is not going to be a good predictor of what happens to the JVP.
Fine. Fair.
I think, to be fair, if I recall, the best the JVP have ever done was around 10% in a presidential election many decades ago. But let me break down. So it's a very complex situation that we see in our polling. So we see that Sajith Premadasa, since earlier this year, took the lead in the presidential preference.
Right.
So he would have won a presidential election pretty much most of this year. But it's more complicated than that. So we also poll on a daily basis political favorability of key figures, which, in other countries like the United States and Europe, the favorability of an individual also is correlated with how well he does in a presidential election or how well the party does in an election, right? So people look at Biden's popularity. It's tapped, right? It's about minus 30 or something these days, or it was about 30% popularity. So we've been tracking that, and the interesting thing is that since the beginning of this year, what we've observed is that, of course, President Gotabaya's favorability collapsed, pretty much in line with consumer confidence. Right. But Sajith Premadasa's favorability also collapsed. Right. So the two of them, and I checked the data this morning before I came in early July, both of them had favorability scores of minus 70.
The same.
This is from going from minus 100 to plus 100. Basically, 8 out of 10 people did not express a positive view of either Sajith Premadasa or the former president. So even though Sajith was in the lead, if there was an election, it was very soft support. It was people essentially reacting to the previous president. Now, when you ask about general election voting preference, where we give people more choices, what we found is, since the beginning of the year, this SLPP its support has collapsed, not surprising. And the SJB UMP support has gone up. We categorize both of those together for trying to predict what goes on. But JVP support goes up. So in our most recent polling in early July, JVP has reached about 30%. So if there was a general election, our best guess is they would get around 30% of the vote. That is far, far higher than they've ever done. And it's difficult to know because it depends how it's distributed, it depends what people do on the day. But my guess is, that what we're looking at creates, this very high unfavorability even for opposition politicians. Even, I must say, even the JVP leader himself, Mr. Wijetilleke, is also unpopular, but he's less unpopular than Sajith Premadasa, I should point out. Right. Because most of the political class is clearly discredited. I think that if you look to March of next year, it is really a wide open question what will happen in the elections in a few months' time, especially given the fact we're going to have to go through a lot of economic pain in the meantime. And my guess is JVP will increase its support, or maybe others further to the left. There's this FSP out there, which is got almost nothing in the last election. So I think that's that. Now, what's going on? I think there are several things, and we haven't had really. I'm making some inferences here from previous polling we've done to look at what people, what's driving, what's in people's heads. Okay. And I think several things. I think that there is widespread rejection of the political class. Okay. And I don't think the politicians understand this. This is, and it's not about corruption. I think because of the experience of people that people have had, it's almost like a pox on all the houses, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing is there's a clear discordance, and it has been there for many years, between what the political class is talking about and what the voters seem to be interested in. Yeah. And particularly on this, my pet topic of taxes and spending, if you ask the public, the majority of the public, overwhelming majorities, say they want the government to spend more on health and education. They want the government to spend more on infrastructure. Right? Now, I'm sure there are people out there who will say, oh yeah, but these people are just dreaming. They think it's a free lunch.
Yeah. And
we've polled that. We've asked people and said, okay, you want to spend more on health or education or samudhi or whatever it is. Do you support that? If we'll tell them, look, the government has no money to increase spending, we have to raise taxes. Do you now support this? Guess what? Health, education, people still want. I mean, support goes down a bit, but overwhelming majority of people say they are willing to accept higher taxes to pay more, spend more money on these basic things, right? Yeah. Where is the opposition? It's in the top 20% of the income range. Mm-hmm. It's the top 20% of the income range who actually are not so happy about spending more if it means more taxes. They're also not so happy about spending more anyway. And they also oppose increases in things like income tax, corporate tax, much more than the majority of Sri Lankans. And you said you might think I'm a contrarian. I think I'm in line with the majority of Sri Lankan voters.
Right.
It's the political class who is not. Because we polled this before the last election, and right. We found this.
Right.
I have an editorial article in the Island I shared with you. And one other thing we picked up, we asked people what they thought was the problem, or the most important problems. Interesting. It was the economy. Yeah. Right? Yeah. It wasn't corruption. Taxes, remember, both political parties ran on manifestos of tax cuts. Yeah. SJB has been very silent on that. Yeah. But they also ran on tax cuts, right? Right. And 4% of our sample said raise taxes as an issue. 96% of our respondents in 2019 did not raise the issue of taxes as being a problem, and both political parties ran on tax cuts. I would say the established political parties are the contrarians, if we take the people of Sri Lanka as the reference. So that's number three. So I think that, the other thing we also found is, even on the corruption issue, we let people express it in their own way. People have they're a bit more sophisticated. I mean, if you ask the kind of words they use, when we try to distill this, it wasn't really corruption that bothered them. I mean, people don't like corruption, so I'm not saying people like it. Mm. But what they were telling us was they disliked the politicization of state services, political interference, the stuff that kind of clogs up service delivery. Ordinary people feel that. Right. That's what they're upset about, politicization of the whole state. Yes, corruption was there, but it wasn't the biggest issue. So I think ordinary people's feelings about good governance was not so much about the corruption, but about effective delivery. Okay. Right? And I don't think that's still not understood. I see several political parties are now campaigning on the issue of reversing the corruption. Yeah. They're not talking about other things without reversing corruption. So I think that's a basic misunderstanding. And a couple of other things that we have also picked up recently in our recent polling, but we also picked up last time, there is a majority of Sri Lankans are increasingly concerned about the gap between poor and rich. Right. In our recent polling, this is a key issue. And we also find that people say they think it's got worse. They think it's something government should do something about, whatever that is. So this is a serious issue. And go back to what the JVP might be capitalizing on. In the 2019 polling, where we looked at some of these attitudes in relation to voting preference, and JVP was an option in that polling. What we found was poorer people were much more supportive of the opposition. They were much more concerned about income inequality, about bad services, about insufficient spending. So the poorer 2/3. And they generally supported, more like to support JVP and SJB. And in fact, there was considerable overlap between the SJB and the JVP. Right. The urban better off supported Gotabaya. Right. And SLPP. So let's be honest, the singular urban middle class better off people, they were the main support base. And I think what's going on now is that the SJP's problem right now is that they have failed to capitalize effectively on the rejection of Gotabaya by the electorate.
Right.
They fail to articulate a message that resonates with the majority of Sri Lankans. And I don't think an anti-corruption message is going to do that. I mean, people are stupid, right? I mean, every election, each side accuses each other of corruption. This has gone on for a century. And people can see beyond that.
Right.
And I think they want real change. I think they're concerned about the income inequality, the social disparities, the lack of services. And I think the JVP, I think, does better at capitalizing on that. And of course, it has the advantage of being maybe less discredited by being less in power than the others.
Okay.